Welcome to MW Voices, Fort Frances. I'm your host, Jack Dawson. We are happy to be bringing you the May 23rd Fort Frances Town Council and Committee of the Whole meetings. Many topics were brought to the councillors, including the 2022 audit financial statements, a look at committees and if changing the structure of these meetings was needed, and a look to the future to encourage more participation in council by younger generations. Things ended off with the support for Hallett's Brewing application for a manufacturer's license.
Okay, we're good now. Okay, sorry. Is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest? And if so, please state the general nature thereof. Councillor McTaggart.
Thank you, Chair. On tonight's Committee of the Whole agenda, item 6.1, the development of the corporate strategic plan. My daughter is an employee of KPMG.
Thank you, Councillor. Any others? Seeing or hearing none, we will now to item 3, delegations and deputations. 3.1, BDO Canada LLP, Town of Fort Frances, 2022 audited financial statements. The recommendation reads that the presentation of the draft 2022 audited financial statements from BDO Canada LLP be received, and that the corporation of the Town of Fort Frances draft consolidated financial statement for the year ending December 31st, 2022, as prepared by BDO Canada LLP, be hereby approved as attached hereto and forming part of this resolution. Mr. Evans, welcome. Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks, John. Thanks for having me, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to present the financials. So I guess just I'm gonna go through the draft financials tonight. We believe they're in final format. Hopefully we'll give you enough comfort tonight after we get through everything and hopefully answer all the questions we can. If not, I'll defer them to Don. And we'll be in a position, I think, to finalize the financials. So like I said, we believe they're in final format, and we'll just go through everything. I usually find that on these presentations, if you have any questions while we're going, please just ask me along the way. It's probably best. So I believe everybody has a copy of the drafts in their package, but see it's up on the screen there as well. Are you controlling it for me? Okay, so probably we'll start by going to page 2. I just want to make a couple of opening comments on that. That's what's referred to as management's responsibilities. That's a requirement of the Public Sector Accounting Board, basically to disclose that the financial statements are the responsibility of management and that it's mayor and council, ultimately their responsibility to ensure the controls are in place to make sure everything's being recorded and recorded appropriately. So that's just a little disclosure, and that's not new. It's something that's been around forever. So you switch over to page 3 and 4. So 3 and 4 is our report. So that's what we're engaged to do, is to do our audit. So just a little bit of history on the audit process. I guess there's the procedures are, we develop a plan, and that plan's based on risk. So working with Don, we come up with a strategy. We look at the areas of the town that are more risky. We spend more time and develop more procedures related to that. Other areas that are less risky, we will spend less time on. At the end of the day, we can't look at 100% of the transactions, so we focus our audit on the risk areas. So our report itself, it really has a few main sections. The first paragraph or the first section is our opinion, and that's the most important part. So we're comfortable and in a position where we're ready to issue what's called a clean audit opinion. So we believe the financial statements are presented fairly in accordance with the public sector accounting standards for the year ended December 31st, 2022. So we will go through that. The remainder of the auditor's report talks a little bit more about the fact that we audit following Canadian auditing standards. It reiterates the fact that the financial statements are yours, and it's our job to give our opinion on the financial statements. That's page 3 and 4. And now we'll get into the good stuff. So if you turn to page 5. So if you're in business, this is referred to as a balance sheet. If you're in a not-for-profit or a municipal world, it's called the statement of financial position. So the best way to explain it is a picture of the municipality at a point in time. So what was there on that date, December 31st? what were your assets, what were your liabilities, and what were your basically non-financial assets, which is your brick and mortar and everything that goes with it. So I'm going to work my way through. I know it's pretty small on the screen, but I'm just going to kind of work my way through and make some comments on increases or decreases for the year, what's made up of those balances, and maybe some, things that are unique to this year. So we'll start with the first section, which is financial assets. So those are all the financial assets that are owned by the municipality. The first item is cash and cash equivalents. So that's basically your bank accounts. Cash and cash equivalents decreased by 26,000 this year, so stayed relatively consistent. That's really made up of two main things. It's your operating bank account and then reserve fund bank account. So most of the time, any excess cash that the town has, it gets moved over into an interest-bearing investment. So you don't generally keep a whole bunch of money just sitting in the bank, right? Most of it goes to work. It's either, and I'm going to get to it in a minute, but it either goes into a GIC that's earning interest or into a high interest savings account. And the majority of the funds at the town are held in what's called a one fund investment. And it's essentially a limited to no risk investment that's paying you interest on that money. So what's interesting this year is those are actually paying, right? It's been a long stretch of 0.001% interest where we didn't see a lot of return on our money. And now we've turned that leaf over. And for some people, that's a bad thing when you have a whole bunch of debt, but when you have a bunch of cash, you're now all of a sudden have this investment income that you're earning from that. So I will refer to that in a minute. The next item is taxes receivable. You can see at the end of this year, the taxes receivable were 458,000, and that's a decrease of 43,000. The town continues to do a very good job of collecting your taxes. Okay, you have your arrears amounts are very small. Anytime you have anybody that hits the 3-year mark, the town management's been very good about following the rules and regulations as far as collections or putting agreement in place. So in a very good place from that perspective. One comment I do want to make on this one, historically, we've always shown the taxes receivable net of prepayments. So the other, I don't want to call it unique, but because it's the same in a lot of municipalities, a lot of people pay their taxes in advance. So at December 31st, you had actually received $453,000 of payments for people for their 2023 taxes. Okay. And what kind of made us decide that we needed to change the presentation this year was if I took those prepayments and applied them to the receivables, it was actually negative. More people have paid you in advance than what's owing to the town. So what they really are, those prepayments are deferred revenue. So they're now included as a liability, but they would get recognized as soon as the new year starts. So it's really just a presentation issue. But again, that's a very good news story. That means that you're billing and collecting, it's the easiest way to say it, I guess, on a regular basis, and that's an important part of running the municipality. So next item is accounts receivable. That's kind of a catch-all. So that's going to be all your grants receivable, both Ontario and federal, that you've earned the income, but you haven't received it yet. And that actually made up a majority of that accounts receivable this year. So it increased by 1.2 million from last year, but we had a lot of big projects going on, which I'll refer to in a little bit. But the Ontario grants receivable were 3.3 million of that balance. Federal grants receivable were 1.3 million. The other one is HST receivable. So the town gets a rebate of some of the HST it pays. You typically apply for that twice a year. And so if you have a lot of capital going on, generally have a big HST rebate at the end of the year. But this year it was 658,000, which was about a $200,000 increase over last year too. So that's where the increases were coming from. We also look at what's called valuation or recoverability of those receivables. So we go look and test to make sure that a lot of that money is either coming in or we don't have any concerns with the fact that we're not going to be able to collect it. So generally speaking, it's just timing for the municipality. Okay, item is investments. So these are your primarily the investments that offset your reserve funds. So it would be it was an increase of 2.1 million this year, and that entire balance is made up of investments in the one fund high interest savings account and GICs. So as I mentioned, interest rates have almost quadrupled this year. So you will see in a little bit that we went from earning interest income or investment income last year of around 109,000 to around 432 this year. So we continue to see that increase going up, and so I anticipate 2023 we'll see even more with regards to return on investments. And then the last item on financial assets are investment in government business enterprises. So 655,000 at the end of the year. That's the Power Corporation and Network Services. So the Power Corporation and Network Services are assets of the municipality. You own them. There's a special accounting treatment that you follow for municipally owned assets. It's called modified equity. So basically, the increase in the carrying value this year versus last year is basically the income of the Power Corporation for the year. So in our case, or in the town of Fort Frances case, the Power Corporation has a mandate of a 0% rate of return. Okay, and that's because that's one of the things that they're mandated to do to try and protect the power agreement credit that's for the residents of the municipality. Now, with that being said, over time, there's going to be some profit or loss that happens, but as long as they're not paying dividends or accumulating significant assets, then that's okay. So that increase is basically the income in the financial statements of the Power Corporation for the year. So that's the total financial assets. Any questions so far? I spend most of the time on this page, by the way, so we're not going to be here all night, I promise. The next section is liabilities. So those are current liabilities of the township. Accounts payable and accrued liabilities would be the first item, 3.248 million at the end of the year. It's about a $200,000 increase. Nothing really significant to speak of. You know, that would include all your trade payables, your holdbacks for major projects, accounts payable for payroll. So, for example, payroll this year, there was 7 days before the end of the year and 7 days after the end of the year. So if payday was on January 7th, then we accrue for half of that payroll to make sure it gets into the right year. So that would be included in payables as well. It would also include vacation accruals and any other payroll related accruals as well. The next item is deferred revenue. So there was a balance of $3,011,000 at the end of the year. That was a significant increase, 1.5 million approximately at the end of the year. And what that is, that's money you've received, but you haven't spent it and earned it yet. Okay, so a good example, well, part of it we talked about, there was about 450,000 of people that paid their taxes in December, but they're for 2023. The other major ones are gas tax. So the federal government gives you gas tax, the provincial government gives you the handy van transit gas tax. You receive that money, but it's not actually yours until you spent it on what they call qualifying expenditures. So until you've spent it, it's deferred. The other way to think of that is until you spend it, it's not yours, it's a liability or you owe it back to them. Now, we're going to make sure that you spend it. Don does a good job of managing that. In the example of the gas tax, you actually have 5 years to spend it. So we watch that very closely to make sure that we're never going to lose any, right? There's plenty of projects to go around typically where we're going to find a way to use that in the community. So the other big one, there was a significant Ontario grant, the Ontario Community Infrastructure Fund. So there was about $1 million that you had physically received at December 31st, but hadn't spent that money yet. Again, under that funding, I believe you have 5 years to spend. So watching that carefully, but it doesn't become revenue until you spend it. Okay. The next item is long-term debt. So that's an exciting one. It's zero. That was the Honeywell project way back when. I don't know if it was a 5-year project or a 10-year project, but it was pretty significant. And we're at the end of that term. So you fully repaid that debt, and the town currently does not have any existing long-term debt. So the nice one. Next item is always a fun one to talk about, the landfill. So probably 15 years ago, the accounting standards changed. The intent of the rules was they wanted mayor and councils to recognize, hey, we have this landfill, but when it's full, we're going to have to close it. We're going to have to monitor it. We're going to have to spend a bunch of money at the end. And so there was a liability there. And so at that time, they introduced these accounting standards. And so you had an obligation to do a study and set up a liability for that. Some municipalities, their landfill has a 300-year life. In other municipalities, their landfill has a much shorter life. And in the case of Fort Frances, at least based on the study, I think we're down to about 5 years. Now, that changes. Obviously, there can be changes in the plan at the landfill. There can be different things, but based on the study and the planned use at the time, there's only about 5 years left. So I think that's something that's coming one way or the other. Interestingly, there's another new standard called the Asset Retirement Obligation Standard. I'm going to talk about it at the end, but essentially the same concept is now getting expanded to more than just a landfill. So as part of this process, what management's going to need to do is, I'm getting ahead of myself, but that's okay. It's good. Part of the process for 2023 is management needs to go through kind of all of your assets, and it has to look and say, what assets do I have that at the end of their useful life, there's an obligation for me to do something with, okay? And a good example of that is the landfill. So the landfill is going to have a new set of rules that they're going to have to follow. So no matter what, your study is more than 10 years old, and we know it's getting near the end. We're going to need some kind of study under the new standards to be able to look at the landfill. But further than that, there's all the brick and mortar of the town, right? Do we have any issues at any of our sites with asbestos, for example? That's a common one that's coming up. Fuel tanks, underground or above ground. Contamination. So there's another standard that was new a few years ago it's called contaminated sites. So the town's already done a lot of legwork on what assets do we have, what problems do we maybe have. I think we have a really good inventory on that piece. What we need to do in 2023 to kind of take it to the next step now is figure out if any of those assets under the new standard, we need to, estimate what the costs are going to be to take care of them, or if there's any issues that we haven't had to deal with. So under the current contaminated sites rules, if you're using the asset, so I'm not saying you have a problem, but let's say you had a fuel tank at the Public Works office, and since you're actively using that, you didn't have to worry about it. It was scoped out. Under the new standard, it takes it to the next step. So we have to look at it and go, okay, if we have an underground tank there, and at the end of its useful life, we got to clean it up. What is that going to cost? So anyways, we will be working with Don on that. It's a fairly big project. Today is not the first day that I'm bringing it up. We've talked about it in the past. It's kind of been coming for a while, but that's probably one of the bigger accounting issues that we're going to face this year. So, okay. Got off track. I was talking about the landfill, but that's good. Just covered some other stuff. And then the last item is post-employment benefits. So that's an actuarial estimate of what the basically the future costs of your contract with the firefighters is for health and dental benefits. So we use an actuary to give us an estimate of what that cost is in present value, and that just gets picked up each year. So that brings us down to what we call net financial assets. Okay. And that, I think, is an important number on these financial statements, because what it represents is if you had to pay off all of your liabilities today, what would you be left with? Okay, and that's your net financial assets. So the town would be left on December 31st with $28,547,000. So your assets exceed your cash liabilities by that amount. Okay, there are some municipalities in a net debt position. Okay, so just to reflect, and people always ask me, well, is that good? Is that bad? I would say you're in a good position from cash flow perspective, right? You know, it's no different than a business or a household. Like you want to be in a position where you can settle all your debts if you have to. So I would say it's definitely a good news story at the end of the day. You know, the other question that often comes up is, well, how many reserves do we need? And I think, you know, I don't have the answer to that either, right? It's really boils back into what projects are happening, what's your long-term plan, what's your financial asset management plan, and what grants are around, right? So that's the other thing we've seen in recent years is sometimes projects come along and they're funded 50-50. So if you have the money and the ability to do it, you get to do those projects. That's great. We've seen other communities where they have no reserves and that project comes along and unfortunately they don't get to do it. So I think there's a bunch of different reasons and related to reserves, but at the end of the day, you are in a good position financially and liquidity wise. Okay. So the last section is non-financial assets. So that's all the stuff that's non-financial. So your buildings, your equipment, your linear assets, your roads, all the stuff that you've invested in as a municipality. Okay. So an increase this year of capital assets of roughly $2.5 million. Okay. So you've invested in about 7.3 million of capital projects. So that would be everything from Kings Highway, Mowat Avenue, computers, major upgrades at the Memorial Sports Center. So all your capital items added up to 7.3 million. And then we depreciate those assets, right? So some of the over time, your buildings get depreciated or your equipment wears out. So that's called amortization. We recognize that it's aging. That number was 4.85 this year, million. So your net, you still added more value to your capital assets than you took away from it, I guess. So we had an increase of 2.5 million this year. The balance of the items there are assets under construction. Really don't have a lot to say about that. Basically, if you have a project that's going on and it's not available for use yet, then it gets set up as a construction in progress, and we move it over to assets when it's completed. Land held for sale, that's Aaron Crescent. Okay, so basically there's two different ways you can treat something like that. One is to show it as a current financial asset, and I would say that would be appropriate when you create a development and sell it within 12 months. Okay, that's not a reality in Fort Frances. We know from history that it takes time for these things to sell. So basically they get treated as a non-financial asset, and as they're sold off, that carrying value will come down. Okay. One thing just to comment on that moving forward is we need to look at valuation. So one of the things we do when we do the audit is we look at the carrying value is 1.45 million. If we have X number of lots and we start to seeing that they're selling for X dollars, if our carrying value is more than what we're going to recover, then we'll do a write down. Okay. At this point, we're comfortable with how it is, but that's just something to be aware of on a carrying forward basis. Inventories of supplies, that would be fuel at the airport, sand, different materials that we have in inventory at stores for the roads, etc. Really nothing special to comment on there. And prepaid expenses, that's primarily insurance. Okay, so your insurance policy doesn't match your year end, and so you pay up on your insurance. So some of it you've prepaid for the following year. Okay, so your total accumulated surplus at the end of the year was 139 million. Like I said, that can be a little bit misleading, so I always want to kind of reiterate that of that 139 million, it's really invested in a bunch of different stuff. So I'm going to go to the note, Don, which is note 10. On page 21. So I personally think this is probably the most important note in the financial statements, because what it's basically doing is it's breaking down that $139 million surplus. Okay. And if you look at the very bottom and under 2022, you can see the 139 million. And then there's a bunch of sections, okay? And what we're doing is we're saying, what's it made up of? The top section is your tangible capital assets, okay? So that's your brick and mortar, your land held for resale, and generally less any debt related to that, okay? Of course, you have no debt this year. So your investment in your tangible capital assets increased by 2.8 million. So we put more money into assets, we paid off our debt, and nothing's really happening with Aaron Crescent at this for 2022. The next section is your current surplus. Okay, so that's the current fund surplus that if you're in a deficit, you need to recover it in your budget next year. If you're in a surplus, you carry it forward to help fund the 2023 dollars. So at the end of this year, there was 473,000 in current fund surplus, and the BIA had $62,000 in surplus. So that was an increase from last year. And so that'll get rolled into your 2023 budget process, or 24 as we move. So the third section we call unallocated deficits. Okay, and the reason for that is that these items typically get funded in the future. So instead of them being part of your current deficit or surplus, we pull them out because there's usually a reserve fund to cover them, for example. So the first item is the landfill closure. So the liability for the landfill at the end of this year is 991,000. Now, this council has chosen to fund that for the most part. So if you look a little bit farther down, you can see the landfill closure has its own reserve fund of 946,000. So you've specifically put aside $946,000 for that landfill. So it's underfunded by 46,000. That's pretty typical to always be trailing. It's like essentially 1 year's funding or whatever. But that's primarily funded. And then the other unallocated deficit is employee future benefits. So that's, we talked about the firefighters' future benefits. That one's not funded. That's also not unusual. Many councils will decide we're going to fund the annual cost of that through operations. Okay, because we know that it's a liability that gets used a little bit each year. It's not going to happen all at once. So we're just gonna plan for that and not put that money aside. We'll just pay for it along the way. That's fine. That's just a decision. Okay. And then the last section is reserves and reserve funds. And that's, you know, what else is our surplus made up of? It's made up of these dollars that we've earmarked and set aside for a future reason. Okay. So we've got 21,995,000, which was about a $1.5 million increase over last year in our reserve funds. So we've set aside more money in our reserves, and those all have a specific purpose, and there's offsetting money there to cover that for future projects. And then at the very bottom, there's what's called the working capital reserve. That's basically your float. That's your float. So that's the money that you use to operate. So receivables, payables, and cash. Go ahead.
Sorry, Councillor McTaggart would like to ask a question.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, John. Just so the numbers from 21 to 22 are cumulative?
Correct.
Okay, so then the actual total operating surplus, general operating would be the 473 less the 268?
No, it would be 473 cumulative.
That's what we have total built up over time.
Yes.
But
So
then
yes, your current year operating would be the difference of the two.
for 2022.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So that's often referred to, like, before the public sector rules came in 2009, everything in a municipality was on a cash basis. Okay. And that's what John's referring to, is essentially your cash surplus from operations for 2022. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to speed up a lot now. So if you go back to page 6, and page 6 is the statement of operations or the income statement. Okay, so what happened during the year? I'm just going to make some comments here at a much higher level. So total revenue for the year increased by 770,000, and total expenses increased by $2,232,000. Now, a couple things I want to comment on. These financial statements are prepared on a PSAS basis, okay? And so I do find that sometimes to be a little bit confusing because the way it works for municipalities are if you get a grant, for example, for something capital, okay? You get $1 million to buy a new fire truck. That $1 million is revenue in the year you get it, okay? The fire truck, though, is an asset and it might be useful for 20 years. And so we write it off over 20 years. So in that first year, you have $1 million of revenue and you've got 1/20th, right? Or $50,000 expense. So you got a $950,000 surplus. I think that's a little bit misleading, but that's how the rules work, okay? So I always like to just stress that anytime you have significant capitally financed grant finance capital, it's going to create a big surplus, okay? It's really back to that operating number that is maybe a true reflection of whether you're managing your cash appropriately. Okay. So just a few of the highlights, I guess, on the revenue side. Taxation revenue was up $267,000. That was about 2%, in line with expectations. Grants, both government and provincial, they vary wildly compared on, based on what's happening, what projects are happening, what projects get completed. We had an interesting year last year with flooding. So on one side was maybe some projects we weren't able to get to, and then on the other side you had some disaster recovery funding. So, all of those things are just constantly in the state of movement. And as part of the audit process and part of Dawn's role, she's doing a good job of making sure that it's getting into the right period. User fees and service charges, they were up quite significantly, 7%, $593,000. I would say there was probably 4 big things in there. Sewer and water rates made up about half of it, usage and rates. The other half, I would say, primarily was actually rec programming and rec facility usage. So 2021, we still kind of weren't fully out of that COVID use of our facilities type thing. And I think 2022 is probably a better reflection of reality. So that's where that bump came from. And investment income, we talked about that. Interest rates went up almost 4 times. So that's where the return came from there. And then the last item on income I want to talk about was other income. So there's a note that has the details there, and I'm not going to go through it today, but the big thing was in 2021, you had a significant donation related to the library, and it was a one-time, a big donation, and so we had a big spike in income that year, which didn't exist this year. So on the expense side, again, I wasn't going to get too granular on this, but labor costs were up about 3.5%. So this statement is reported by what's called function. Okay, so by general government, protection, transportation, all the different services that the municipality delivers. The other way you can look at it, there's actually a note in the financial statements further on where it breaks it down by the type of expenditure. So the total expense is the same, it just reports in it a different way. So you can see what was spent on salaries and labor, materials, financial services, and that is available. Now, in general, I would say all costs increased, and I think that's something that we're seeing in every business, every municipality. Labor was up, but more than labor, supplies were up significantly more, services were up more, everything costs more, right? And that's again in line with, in check with the expectations. So audit fees. Okay. So the rest of the financial statements, I wasn't going to go through in detail. I certainly can take any questions. I know there's a lot more pages, but what's there is really supporting information for the items that I've already talked about, okay? And all the disclosures that are in there are the required disclosures, so there's enough information on, the types of funding you get, the funding, whether it's government, provincial versus federal, all of those different items. So I have a few other things I want to talk about, but maybe I'll take any questions on the financial statements.
Any councillors have any questions for Mr. Evans at this time? Seeing none, we will move on, John.
Good. So I'll just wrap it up. So other than the financial statements, we also prepare what's called the financial information return. So I'm going to a little bit more detail because there's some new members here, but the municipality is required to report to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing using what's called the financial information return. It's just their version of the financial statements. It's a very detailed spreadsheet that I do a bunch of work on, and then I give to Dawn, and she has to do a whole bunch more work on before it goes in, and it's due by the 31st of May. So we have our piece ready to go. We're going to get it to Dawn, and she'll do her part. So that's coming. Also included in this package, we do an audit on the trust funds. So any of the funds that the municipality, that they're not municipal funds, but they're held in trust for you. So for example, the cemetery trust money is a good one. Historically, there was the tennis courts. So you collected monies on behalf of the tennis courts. The community chest is another one. So those are monies that are in control of the municipality, but they're not municipal money. Okay, so we do a separate audit on that. It's part of the package. I'll issue what's called an independence letter, confirming that I'm independent of the municipality and therefore I can do my job independently and objectively. I'm going to send a package to Dawn that she can share with council. It's basically just a summary letter going over some of the stuff we talked about today. Included in there is some information on that entire asset retirement obligation. So if anybody's interested in that and the new standards, there's hyperlinks in the electronic version, so you can go and check it out. Sure, keep you awake all night, excitement. And then there's a management letter. So one of the things, if we have findings sometimes, that we want to bring to the attention of council or to management, we have a management letter. We didn't have anything like specific concerns we wanted to bring forward, but one of the items in there will be, hey, don't forget this asset retirement obligation is coming and we need to get ahead of it now because it's going to be, it's going to impact the 2023 financials. So, and then lastly, we have a representation letter. So it's a letter that Dawn signs and usually the mayor saying, we provided you everything we need to be able to do your audit, which we believe we've got. So really appreciate the efforts of administration. It's a big task getting ready for the audit. It's a big organization. Obviously, it's a $139 million surplus, so there's a lot of moving parts. And for us to be able to do our audit, it has to be ready to be able to stand here. So thank you very much. It went well. So appreciate the help and makes me look better when it's done well. So thank you. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans. Again, anyone on council wish to make a comment or a question for Mr. Evans?
Thank you.
Seeing none, John, thank you very much for coming out tonight, and to BDO Canada LLP for your presentation. And I just want to echo what you said by thanking our treasurer, Don Glusha, and her staff for all their excellent work they do in handling the town's finances and all the accounting that entails and keeping everything in order. So great work, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Oh, thank you again, John, for coming out. Brings us to item 3.2, final report governance review. Bruce Peaver, partner, public sector advisor, and Sana Malik, senior manager, public sector advisory, KPMG Canada. Recommendation reads that the presentation of the final report on the governance review from KPMG be received, and that council directs administration to review its findings and bring back recommendations for implementation. And I see Bruce and Sana there, so welcome again to our council meeting, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. We are pleased to be here tonight to present our final report on the governance review. What we propose to do, Council, is to walk you through the recommendations of the report, and at the end, we'd be pleased to take any questions. If it's all right, Mr. Chairman, I'd proceed.
Please go ahead.
So KPMG was engaged by the town to conduct a comprehensive review of its current governance model and policies. And if you remember, the objective of the review was to enhance the town's governance-related policies, structures, and processes by one, auditing the town's use of committees, and then two, taking a look at the roles and clarifying the roles of council, committees, staff, and the policies for in-camera meetings. Okay. So we were engaged at the beginning of this year, and we have finished the report now at the end of May. We turn the page again, Sana, and you can see over that period of time the 4 different phases of work. So in January, we kicked off the project. In February and March, we conducted a current state assessment that included interviews, which we completed largely on site in the town. And then we did a jurisdictional scan as part of that current state assessment, which led us to the work in April and May, where we prepared recommendations on the governance model for the town, and then we wrapped it up in a final report this May. If we turn the page again, Sana. So just before Sana leads you through the recommendations, what we did in our assessment is we used something called a maturity model, and that is a way of assessing the governance of the town against leading practice. And you can see here that the 3 elements contained within the maturity model are governance structure, governance roles, and governance processes. And our expectation, given the the capabilities of your staff and the resources of council, is that over the next 3 years, you should be able to reach an optimized level of maturity on this particular model. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sana, and she's going to walk you through the different recommendations around structure, roles, and processes. Sana?
Thank you, Bruce. If you have seen the final report, we had a total of 14 recommendations, and I'm going to do a high-level review of each one of them. So the first recommendation we had was the governance structure. As we know, through our interim report, the challenges that were noted in the current governance structure was that it was a barrier to effective and efficient decision-making. And further, the current structure resulted in unclear roles and responsibilities between the committees and staff capacity constraints within the clerk's office. So we can see that between the council meetings and the committee of the whole meetings, stakeholders indicated that there were short time frame and that did not provide an opportunity for participants to ask meaningful questions. For the executive committees, we heard that they're inconsistently held due to insufficient agenda items or there's an incomplete quorum. And many stakeholders also expressed that the Economic Development Executive Committee agenda items were administrative and did not address key matters. During our independent audit, we noticed inconsistencies in how the executive committees were managed. So for example, some committees went straight from the CAO to council. In another OPEC committee, it went through the manager of operations through the council. Also for the Economic Development Committee, that was the only committee which allowed public participation. It was also noted that decisions could be made at the executive committees, as sometimes these meetings have the required council quorum. And as such, other council members who are not part of the executive committee may not have the same level of information or be involved in the decision-making process. And overall, all stakeholders expressed that executive committees create an additional layer of red tape. So keeping all this in mind and what we heard during our initial phase of work, what we did was we looked at 3 different options for the town to consider. These options were based on findings from our previous phases and can be tailored to the town's specific requirements as well. So the 3 options that we looked at were: 1 was to dissolve your executive committees and committee of the whole. As you can see from here, we just have 1 council meeting per month. The second option is to dissolve your executive committees, but keep your committee of the whole. And you can see this option is also optimized where you have 1 week gap between the committee of the whole and council, unlike now where it's held on the same day. And the third option is to reduce the meeting frequency. So instead of having your executive committees twice a month, you have them once a month. You space out your committee of the whole and council again by less than a week. And you also have more space between the executive committees and the committee of the whole, allowing administration time to put together the agendas. So what we did after identifying the models, we developed an evaluation criteria with a defined weighting to understand what would be the most quantifiable way of determining the optimal model. So the 4 criteria that we put together were stakeholder consultations. This is what we heard. The jurisdictional scan. So basically, what are some of the best practices implemented by comparative municipalities? We looked at our own policy setting audit results. What were the gaps identified? And lastly, we looked at the alignment of the model to principles of good governance. And we've included the framework for good principles of good governance in the appendix of the final report. But it means is that whatever model you're selecting, it encourages stakeholder transparency. It includes senior leadership. There's simple and clear direction, and it has the ability to handle all situations. So after we evaluated each of the options against the evaluation criteria that I just went over, what we found was that the second option ranked the highest, which was to dissolve the executive committees. And this option aligned heavily with stakeholder sentiment, the jurisdictional analysis, and the principles of good governance. The second option that after the option 2 was to reduce the meeting frequency, and the last option was to dissolve the executive committees and committee of the whole and have one council meeting. I'm going to move on, and I guess we're going to take questions at the end. But the second observation was around your advisory committees. During the current state analysis, we noted that the maintenance and operations of advisory committees require significant staff effort, with staff spending time on average of 4 hours per meeting on agenda preparation, minute taking, and correspondence. In addition, it was also noted that there was overlap in the objectives on some advisory committees, and the town has struggled to get volunteers as well. Further, the results of our own audit testing noted that only 5 out of the 11 in-scope advisory committees had a formalized terms of reference to outline this objective, scope, meeting, etc. And as a result, it can be challenging for the town to enforce expectations and scope of each committee. So as a result, what we're recommending here is for the town to consider consolidating or dissolving select advisory committees. And to determine how to or which advisory committees to dissolve or consolidate, we've shared some guiding principles or an evaluation criteria for you to consider. For example, is maintaining the AC or advisory committee a legislative requirement? Does the advisory committee contain similar or the same number of members as another advisory committee? Is there a similarity of objectives between advisory committees? For example, does the committee have a formalized terms of reference with defined objectives? And lastly, does the committee meet on a consistent basis? Who is maintaining or monitoring the administration? One of the best practices, what we know to have seen in another Ontario municipality, is that the number of executive committees and advisory committees are evaluated at each term of council. And these municipalities allow council to consider the type, structure, and the number of committees that will provide information to council during that term. And as such, each committee is evaluated at the end of the term to provide the new council with necessary information and recommendations, and then they can decide whether they want to continue with that committee or they want to dissolve. The next recommendation was around governance roles. So the observation was that staff host an orientation to educate new and also incumbent council members of their roles and responsibilities. Whereas all council members found the orientation to be informative and useful, not all members availed the continuous training opportunities. So there's a recommendation for staff to promote opportunities for ongoing training and education for elected officials. And we've added some areas how that can be achieved. We move on to the governance processes, and these are important because you'll notice we have sort of mentioned 1.1 because 1.1 is your framework, however, which direction you want to go. But for successful implementation of your governance structure, it's really important for these governance processes to be implemented. So for example, we'll talk about the first one, 3.1, terms of reference. So as we said before, staff reported that a lack of terms of reference has contributed to inefficient and inconsistent use of your executive and advisory committees. So as a result, it can be challenging for the town to enforce the scope of its governance meetings. And what we're recommending is for the town to create or update your terms of reference for all your committees. And we have added in a caveat. If you're dissolving executive committees, then obviously you don't need terms of reference, but you'll still need to update them for your advisory committees. 3.2 is around your procedural bylaw. The town refers to the procedural bylaw to establish committees of council. However, we noted that elements of this procedural bylaw needed to be updated. So as a recommendation, we're saying for the town to update the procedural bylaw to outline the current governance structure, provide clarity on roles and responsibilities of committees, and define the decision-making process. And we've given an example specifically around citizen engagement and how to manage that during council meeting. 3.3, again, this is pivotal for whatever structure you establish, but the town currently does not have a delegation of authority bylaw that will allow administration to address operational matters. And as such, currently all operational matters have to be approved by council. So what we're recommending here is for the town to develop the delegation of authority bylaw. And this resource will support decision-making by clarifying approval authorities and processes. 3.4, it's around your strategic plan. We understand the town strategic plan expired in November 2022, and currently the town is in the process of acquiring the services of a third party to develop a revised strategic plan. And we've identified this as a recommendation because it is important for the town to include this in all staff reports moving forward. 3.5. Council members reported that staff provide excellent advice to council to support decision-making. However, some council members expressed concerns that they might not be receiving all the necessary information required for decision-making. And as such, the recommendation here is that staff reports link all decisions to strategic plans, your policies, and include thorough financial implication in all staff reports. 3.6, it was noted that some town policies are not reviewed at their prescribed frequency. Currently, tracking review timelines is a manual process, and there is sometimes uncertainty among stakeholders regarding roles and responsibilities, like who's supposed to be doing what. And as such, the recommendation is to develop a process to review policies on an ongoing basis. 3.7, it was noted that agenda items are not consistently reviewed and approved by the CAO before they are added to the council agenda. As a result, stakeholders noted some agenda items are operational in nature and should not be discussed perhaps at council meetings. Essentially, the recommendation here is to develop a process on how agenda items get approved so that the CAO has the eventual authority to determine if it's operational or strategic and what should be presented to council. 3.8, with the current governance structure, meetings occur every week and require significant administrative support. And as a result, sometimes agenda items are not reportedly issued on a consistent and timely manner. And that does not allow council sufficient time sometimes to review all the information. So the recommendation is to review the process and timing of agenda publication. And once the preferred governance option is agreed upon, then the town can determine the standards to follow. 3.9, the town does not have a policy to handle service requests or complaints. However, the policy is outdated, vague, and inconsistent. And currently, all matters addressed to the town are delegated to an executive committee for review, and then they come to a committee of the whole and then back to council. So as such, there's an opportunity to review and update the complaint policy for citizens to voice their concerns. And some of these governance, these are more service delivery opportunities, but they impact the governance. And hence we find that if the town is able to address these, it will just allow you to have a stronger governance structure. 3.10, the town does not currently have a process to formally solicit feedback on closed service requests. And through our jurisdictional review, it was identified that comparative municipalities are using service request information systems to track what requests are coming in, how quickly they're responded to and closed off. And we're recommending a similar process to be established for the town of Fort Frances. And lastly, based on review of meeting minutes through the policy setting environment audit, inconsistencies were noted in recording minutes from in-camera sessions. While some minutes were recorded if a meeting had in-camera items, others did not report in-camera items. Essentially, we could not determine whether there were any in-camera meeting discussion had or not. So essentially what we're saying is we ensure compliance with closed meeting legislation so that all in-camera meetings are captured all the time if they're had. Those were the end of our process observations. What we have done on this slide is called a prioritization matrix. We often get the question, okay, so how do we start? Where do we start from? The opportunities at the top right are the strategic projects. So if you can recall, 1.1 was your governance model and 1.2 was consolidating your advisory committees. So those are your strategic projects. There were other projects, mostly operational, or setting up your governance processes, which were quick wins, which could be done by staff or administration. And then there were others which were medium-term projects, which take longer and might need more time. That's the end of our presentation. You have seen the detailed report. Perhaps I'm going to open the floor for any questions.
Thank you very much, Sana. I just have a couple of more observations than anything. First of all, when you're looking at your maturity model, governance maturity model, as you saw on the chart on page 9, it's clear that we have a ways to go. And so I certainly appreciate all your recommendations on how we can achieve that. It's very helpful to us. In speaking to the options under item 1.1, the 3 options, and looking at this, I'm actually looking at option 1 to dissolve the executive committees and the committee of the whole, even though it ranked the lowest of the 3. I'm not sure the value of COW if the same items are going to come up at the council meeting 2 weeks later for approval. It seems like duplication. You're taking 2 meetings to make a decision. And I'm not sure that's the best use of time. But if I do like option 1, the big caveat for me is that I would like to see 2 council meetings a month, except for July, August, and December. That way you've got 2 council meetings. It shortens the agendas, more timely things to do. And that's a suggestion I'd like to see maybe included, or some that maybe administration would look at as they're looking through the recommendations as well. But right now I'm sort of leaning towards option 1, as long as we have 2 council meetings per month, not just the 1. Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor McTaggart.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. And my question is in regards to your option 2 and the committee of the whole. In your comparator communities, do you have any indication of how long the committee of the whole meetings were?
Maybe I can take that one. So we did ask that question, and they had mentioned that the committee of the whole for 2 of our comparative municipalities had option 2 with the committee of the whole and a gap of 1 week and a council meeting. And they had mentioned, if I recall correctly, the meetings were for 3 to 4 hours for the committee of the whole.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Mayor Halkus.
I don't necessarily have any questions right now. I have a number of comments. I don't want to make them all at once because I want other people to have a chance to talk. But the comment that I wanted to make is, first of all, thank you very much for what I think is an excellent report and an excellent analysis of where we are right now and where we could be in the future if we implement some of these. Our present form of government has been in effect since the 90s, and now we're in 2023. So times have changed, and in order to govern effectively, I think that we need to change with the times. The other thing that I wanted to comment on, like the big, bold sexy change is the first one where we look at the frequency of meetings and how we meet. But I hope council has reflected and read this report thoroughly, because none of those three options are going to work unless we implement all of the other, what might appear to be lesser suggested changes. They're all really, really important to implementing whichever version, whichever model that you favor. So I'll just stop with my comments there because others may want to speak. I'll say some more later.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Anyone else would like to say? Councilor Bernetta.
Thank you. Again, I don't really have a question, but I really appreciated the part of your report that showed comparator communities and what they're doing. And the fact that they've made changes in the recent past as well is really important to know, because I guess we're just kind of behind times here, and it's time for us to consider changing as well. So I appreciate that. And I also was wondering the comment that Councillor McTaggart made just around how long it would be, because I have heard from other places, probably larger centers, that if you eliminate the committee of the whole meetings altogether, then your council meetings are much longer. So that's another issue that I was concerned about. Thank you.
Anyone else wish to weigh in? I'll just make one more comment. I certainly agree with the other 13 recommendations that you brought forth. I think they all seem logical and reasonable and doable in a relatively short time frame. And as Mayor Halakas alluded to, it's all part and parcel to doing everything together so that it all works in sync. In fact, I think in some of the cases, we're already doing some of the things, like number 3.5. Many of the reports, staff reports, do provide links to the strategic plan and financial implications. It's, for example, if proposals are coming in under or over budget, and if they're over, how that shortfall will be covered. And if it's unbudgeted, they offer advice on how best to fund this. 3.4 is an example that's already underway with their coming up with the strategic plan. And 3.11 improvement, I've seen improvement with our in-camera minutes already too as well. So I think we're well on our way to some of these already, and I think the rest of them are certainly doable as well and much needed here. Thank you. Mayor Halakas.
I'll make a couple more comments. I wanted to say that there's not one of those recommendations that I disagree with. I think they're all go towards helping us improve what we're doing. Our present structure, if you look at it with the number of meetings that we have, just think of the amount of staff time that goes into writing an agenda for every one of those meetings, doing minutes for every one of those meetings. It's a phenomenal amount of staff time, hours and hours of staff time. Again, and not to mention the amount of time that you councillors put in prepping for meetings and going to meetings. And I think that we can be much more efficient in how we govern by reducing the number of meetings and implementing some others of these recommendations. Having said that, to implement these things, I like the sort of matrix that was presented. I mean, we've got the two big kind of strategic ones that you want to work on, but then you've got the easy wins. It's nice to see that there's a place to start. I think that's important, because it could seem to be an overwhelming task, but there it's laid out. There's a nice place to start. But again, I think we have to bear in mind that all of these changes, and there are many of them and a variety of them, have to be done by staff. So that's going to take staff away from their work to implement these changes. So we need to be cognizant of that. And so it's going to have to be, baby steps. We're going to have to be logical in how we do this so that we don't have staff spending too much time all at once on this. And having said that, there's a lot of change here, and people handle change differently. But in this case, I think the change is essential. We want to be with the times. Our governance structure is not reflective of the times that we're living in. But recognize that as we go through these changes, there's going to be bumps on the road. So we'll feel our way through. And as we implement some of these things, I think we may have to make changes to the changes as we go through. It's going to be a work in process as we're ably guided by our staff and this report. Okay, enough talking from me.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councilor McTaggart.
Thank you, Chair. I quite agree that I think the changes that are listed here are all doable, and I'm looking forward to administration's recommendations on how to handle the change and the order to take them in. One thing that I hope that administration will consider is the use of advisory committees, because I really believe that it's a good way to engage our citizens in areas that those citizens have a passion for. And I would like you to seriously consider how you're going to address the advisory committees, and hopefully many of them will stay intact. Thank you.
Councilor Mackey.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to concur with Councillor McTaggart on the advisory committees because of exactly what he said, having the community involved, then we get feedback from them as well. As far as the three options, I am leaning to the second option, but rather than have a committee of the whole once a month and a council meeting once a month, why can't those both be council meetings? Because the committee of the whole is effectively the council sitting, except we can't make a decision. We got to defer it for 2 more weeks down the road. And so once a month committee meets to make decisions, which I find that delays many things that need a quicker response.
That was the point I was trying to make with option one, is that I have no problem with option one as long as there's 2 council meetings, which is not increasing meeting frequency. And that way we can shorten agendas and space between, and we can table something if we need further discussion. That to me is what I'd like to see. And I think that's sort of what you were saying, Councillor Mackey. Any further questions? Councillor Olson.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm going to be disliked. It's okay. I'm okay with that. But I've given this a lot of thought just based off of our previous conversation and the information that was presented to us the last time. And I have to say that I do appreciate option 2. I'm a working person, commitment to the community. I have a family, but there's also this big overarching cloud, I think, that follows us around with council and the municipality itself around communication and transparency. And the committee of the whole, I think, could help fill that gap when there is time between the committee of the whole meeting and the council meeting itself. I think there's an opportunity there to engage the community more, to get them involved, to give more voice at the table. And I also think that it helps inform our decision-making better. If we're missing information, we're not gathering it at the last minute, we can make a better informed decision. So when I seen option 2 presented, I actually appreciated it. I recognize that committee of the whole may take longer, but we're making decisions that are impacting the next 7 generations. So, as a working person, I can substitute those 3 to 4 hours if it influences decision making, in a better way for an extended period of time. So I just wanted to share that tonight.
Thank you, Councillor Olson. Mr. Robb.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and my question's directed to Bruce and Sana, and it's kind of along the same lines of what we've been talking about. In your experience outside of this review and what you saw through the review, do you see a risk from a timing perspective of going down to 1 council meeting per month, whether that be with or without a committee of the whole, in terms of decision making and making, bringing things in a timely manner through and getting, resolutions in a timely manner?
Perhaps I'll answer that, Sana. Mr. Chairman, to your CAO. The purpose of a committee of the whole and a regular council meeting are materially different. So the purpose of a regular council meeting is much more transactional. So you're approving decisions, and it is you're approving bylaws, and so the decisions are legislatively final. At a committee of the whole meeting, it's a meeting that's set up to allow council the ability to engage and ask questions and explore different issues that are, being presented to council and to the broader community. So for example, tonight you had your external auditor present on the 2022 financial statements. That could appear at the committee of the whole meeting, and it would allow council to delve deeper into any particular issues related to the financial statements or ask questions. Sometimes, issues or decisions need to be made. And in my experience, I see councils use the regular council meeting to make sure that important transactions do occur. So such as the awarding of large capital contracts or purchases, that they occur at a regular council meeting. And again, the committee of the whole is much more assigned broader policy or strategic issues for council to debate. So for that reason, if you use the committee of the whole and the regular council meeting correctly, you don't find the risk is as high in the delay of decisions. I hope that answers the question, Mr. Chairman, to your CAO.
Thank you, Bruce.
And perhaps if I can add on to that, the comparative municipality that had one council meeting was, I pulled up the report, was the municipality of Sioux Lookout. So they just have one council meeting per month. And based on our interview, and it's also part of the interim report, they started off with a committee of the whole and a council meeting. But over time, they realized that there was a lot of repetition. So at that time, they decided to dissolve the committee of the whole and stick with council meetings. And if there are agenda items which they cannot be delayed because of urgency, then they have special council meetings to address those matters.
Thank you, Sana. Again, last call for questions, Mayor Halkus.
Just some more comments.
Or comments?
Try and keep it fairly short. I wanted to comment a bit on what Councillor Olson said, because she hit on something important there. I too lean towards some version of option 2, whether it's a committee of the whole meeting and a council meeting or 2 council meetings. I mean, there's room for some flexibility there. If you opt for 2 council meetings, you would have to somewhat change the nature of your council meeting. You'd have to put a section on there where you can have input from the public delegations and so forth, like what we just had. What's important to me about the second option is I think it would be important that we have whatever 2 meetings in the evening. And I think it's important that we're, by implementing some of the other suggestions, we can effectively do away with the executive committees. What that does then, by not having executive committees and not having meetings during the day, is it allows it allows other people, more people, to run for council, people who are working. And right now, that's an issue. We have people who'd like to run for council, but they can't due to responsibilities during the day. So that's a big selling point to me for some version of choice 2 with executive committees reviewed. And I think an important factor in that one is the delegation of authority bylaw. With the executive committees, I think a lot of the times council is starting to delve into the area of operations, which is really not a thing that we should be doing. And by having a good bylaw that allows delegation of authority, we really would remove a lot of the stuff that was on the executive committee, so we wouldn't be missing them. So again, I'm leaning strongly towards some version of option 2.
Thank you, Mayor Halkus. Bruce or Sana, any closing comments from you before we wrap this up?
No, Your Worship. Thank you very much for allowing us to present.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank KPMG and especially Bruce and Sana for all your hard work and your presentation tonight and presenting this final report for us. And I'm really, as already been said, I'm looking forward to the recommendations that administration are going to bring forth for implementation. So thank you very, very much for this very thought-provoking and important report, and it's much appreciated. So guys, have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.
That brings us to item 4, council reports on board and committee activity. Mayor Halkus.
As usual, I have a fairly lengthy report, but we've already had a couple of lengthy presentations. I'm just going to address one issue, and it's actually not on my report because it's something that came up after the deadline for reports to council occurred. I want to talk a little bit about the Rainy River First Nations fish fry that occurred on May 19th. Deputy Mayor, me and myself attended the Rainy River First Nations annual fish fry at the invitation of Chief Horton. He was very, very gracious to send us a personal invitation. And we decided that we'd like to volunteer to help out. So we went out there early. We arrived shortly before noon and spent the next 3.5 hours over a deep fryer cooking potatoes. And I do have to say those potatoes were delicious. But what I really wanted to comment on was this was the 51st annual fish fry put on by Rainy River First Nations. Rainy River First Nations for 51 years have been feeding their friends and neighbors. And the feast was amazing. Fresh walleye, smoked sturgeon, the delicious potatoes, baked beans, wild rice, bannock salad. It really was a feast, and everyone was made welcome and everyone was fed. It was a beautiful day. Lots of people came out to visit, and there was lots of talking and laughter and, hanging out with friends and, of course, eating. To me, one of the kindest and most generous things that anyone can do is to share what they have with others, particularly their food. And so I'm deeply grateful to Chief Horton, his council, and all the members of Rainy River First Nations for their generous and gracious gesture of friendship to their friends and neighbors in the district. And what an example they're setting for all of us for the past 51 years. I did want to also mention briefly, there was a bit of a program, and it was an excellent program. Prior to feasting, Chief Horton spoke to those gathered about Indigenous fishing rights and how they must be protected. And then later in the program, Murray and Luann Bombay were honored for winning a court case that ensured and enshrined First Nations fishing rights. Murray and Luann told a captivating story of their court case from the time they were charged by the Crown as it went through the courts and through appeals until eventually they were vindicated and the charges were dropped, thus protecting, as Chief Horton said, Rainy River First Nations' right to eat. It was a compelling story. Another really poignant thing that occurred was Ted Brocky and his sister Helen appeared, and their family had a gold medal that was given out when Treaty 3 was signed 150 years ago. And apparently there's only 2 such gold medals in existence. One is in Ottawa, and Ted and his sister Helen presented the other one to Chief Horton and Rainy River First Nations, which I thought was a wonderful gesture, and I salute them for making it. And I was also honored by Chief Horton in being asked to say a few words, so that I brought greetings and thanks from the town of Fort Frances, our council, and the residents of Fort Frances. and I spoke briefly about generosity, friendship, and gratitude, all three of which I feel strongly were displayed by Rainy River First Nations. So I thank you, Deputy Mayor Bean, for coming out and for helping out and spending the day. And heartfelt thanks again to Chief Horton, his council, and members of Rainy River First Nations for their hospitality and friendship. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That concludes my report.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We have no other reports tonight from council. So we'll move on to item 5, consent agenda. 5.1, approval of consent agenda. I think this is the first time I've ever had to read this. Recommendation that the matter listed on the consent agenda be referred to the consent agenda for the regular meeting of council later tonight for approval, being item 5.2. Pardon me. Item 5.2, video surveillance policy. The recommendation reads that council of the town of Fort Frances agrees with the recommendation of administration from item AR-23-02662. 1, prepare a bylaw authorizing the mayor and clerk to implement the video surveillance policy on behalf of the corporation. And 2, prepare a bylaw authorizing the mayor and clerk to execute the video surveillance system access agreement with His Majesty the King in the right of Ontario, as represented by the Minister of Community Safety and Correctional Services, operating as the Ontario Provincial Police, Rainy River District, Northwest Region, on behalf of the corporation. Would any councillor member wish to pull this item? Mayor Halkus.
Just wanted to point out, I've received a few emails and phone calls from concerned citizens concerned about privacy and surveillance. And I think what happened in most cases when I contacted the people and discussed with them the situation, it's that they didn't have the facts, that they weren't informed about what is really going to happen. So I just want to point out to everyone that if you go on the town website and you scroll down to Safe Streets, it has all of the information and safeguards on this project. So have a look at that if you do have some concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Halkus. Item 5 would be struck off, not consented. I have a recommendation that the matters listed on the consent agenda be referred to consent agenda, the regular meeting of council later tonight for approval. Being item 5.2, which we pulled, so I'm not sure how that works. Let's leave it at that then. So I need a mover and seconder. Oh, I didn't add it at all. Okay, very good. Thank you, Madam Clerk. Okay, that brings us on to item 6. Administration and Finance Division, 6.1, award of RFP 2023-AF-01, development of a corporate strategic plan 2023 to 2027. Recommendation reads that council approval of report AR-23-0273 will agree with the recommendation of administration to award the development of a corporate strategic plan to KPMG, and further that mayor and clerk be authorized to execute the agreement on behalf of the corporation. I believe, Mr. Rob, have you anything more to say to that?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, through the chair. So we advertised for a consultant to undertake a strategic planning session for council in the town of Fort Frances. I want to thank the clerk for her assistance and help me get this put together and make sure we had everything covered. We had 2 submissions, one from KPMG and one from Capital Park Consulting. To undertake the work, both of them, the overall schedules were fairly similar, with the work happening as soon as possible, getting started as soon as possible. Both included a broad-based consultation within their proposal, including staff, council, and the public. we did budget $25,000 for the work under this. KPMG did come in just slightly over the budget. And that budget shortfall would be funded through the modernization fund, which is what the initial project is funded under. So the recommendation coming forward is to award to KPMG.
Thank you, Mr. Rob. Any questions? Seems to me that it's the lowest bid. It'll be done in a faster time frame, so I'm certainly good with it, even though it's a little bit over budget. So that'll come up for approval at our meeting, regular council meeting later tonight. That brings us to item 6.2, Sunny Cove direction. Recommendation reads, council approval of report AR-23-0274 will agree with the recommendation of administration that 1, administration apply to the Northern Ontario Heritage Fund Corporation for funding to address the structural condition of Russell Hall. 2, that administration upon receipt of the funding issue an RFP for the completion of the structural design work, including preparation of tender specifications and drawings. 3, that council approve the unbudgeted, capital expenditure related to the completion of this work. 4, that council approve the unbudgeted operating expenditure required to maintain the property for the summer, including grass cutting, trimming, and general yard cleanup. 5, that council direct administration to begin preparing to operate Sunny Cove Camp in the summer of 2024, and further that bookings start to be taken for late summer 2024. And 6, and further that administration discuss with the Kiwanis Club the continued relevance of the restrictions originally imposed when the town took over Sunny Cove to investigate removing some to potentially open the property up to new uses and revenues. Again, I'll turn to Mr. Rob. Off.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So coming back before council again for some direction is the matter of Sunny Cove. As we had discussed, we have no money in the capital budget to address the capital issues there. We have no money in the operating budget to maintain the property for the year. So looking for some direction from council on ways forward. I've kind of broken it out, in a number of areas in the administration recommendation, including a cost estimate to undertake at least minimal care of the property, being about 16 hours a week for the summer months for basically basic lawn care and yard maintenance. I tried to break down at a high level a lot of the work that has to happen at Russell Hall to shore that structure up and provide some improvements so that it would be usable for potentially the 2024 summer season. The timeline on it is really related to trying to be contract awarded, shovel ready for about this time next year so that we can get a contractor in there, get the work done to Russell Hall over the months of like May and June next year, and be in a position possibly into July, for sure into August, having that Russell Hall ready for the public to utilize. So that's the rationale. That's my rationale behind the timeline of it all. Starting, of course, first with securing some funding, and then going from there. And if there's anyone with any questions related to the recommendation, I'd be happy to answer them.
Councillor McTaggart.
Thank you, Chair, and through you to Mr. Rob. I thank you for the recommendations, and I know that we did not leave the last meeting with any direction for administration, so hopefully we'll have something coming out of this meeting. I certainly can support the application to NOHFC for the structural condition study and moving to an RFP. I'm having a tough time at this point saying, sure, let's approve an unbudgeted capital expense that we don't know what it is. And I think we need to have some tangible number before I can be in support of that. Number 4, the maintenance you're saying is 16 hours a week. Okay, thank you. And That, I think 5 and 6 makes sense too, but I'm struggling with the open checkbook on number 3. Thank you.
Mr. Rob?
Yeah, just on number 3, at this point in time, because of the specialized nature of the work, I wouldn't even want to hazard a guess at what sort of cost is involved with the design component to it. Given that we will be going to an RFP per the procurement policy, that RFP will have to be approved by council. So at that point in time, we'll know exactly what the price is.
Councilman Taggart?
Just to follow up, if I may, would it make sense that there's another application in NOHFC to possibly cover some of the costs for the redevelopment of Russell Hall?
Thank you, through the chair. Yeah, given the way I have this worked out, NOHFC will fund the design as part of the overall project. So step 1 is to put the application in for the whole project, including design. And then once we have the funding secured, proceed with issuing the RFP under that umbrella.
Mayor Halkus?
No question, just another comment. I wanted to thank CAO Rob for his work on this file. As Councillor McTaggart alluded to at the last council meeting, we sort of left administration high and dry. We voted not to sell Sunny Cove, but we didn't give any instructions. So I know that CAO Rob has been doing a lot of work on this, and it's a very straightforward, logical approach, I think, to a fairly complicated problem. So thank you very much, CAO Rob, for your work and for presenting something that council can dig their teeth into a little bit.
Councillor Olson?
Thank you, through the chair to the CEO. It's just more of a question. So when this RFP goes forward, I know we're looking at structurally repairing Russell Hall, but if it's at a point that like there's too much work or the risk is too high to start rebuilding it, are we also considering like what a new build would look like in that location, like ripping down Russell Hall and perhaps building a new building?
Mr. Rob?
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly something that I've been wrestling with. I don't think cost-wise it's going to be cheaper than repairing what we have. Far less complicated, but I don't necessarily think cheaper. That being said, I haven't, built a lot of log structures in my day, so I don't know. Part of getting a firm in here and taking a look at it, they may come back and say rebuilding or repairing is not an option. But short of going and getting that, qualified expertise from someone that does deal with log buildings all the time, I don't think we would be necessarily money ahead to plan to tear it down and rebuild. I think that would be more costly than repairing.
I think my concern is very much like Councillor McTaggart's with number 3, and I'm wondering how we can approve an unbudgeted capital expense tonight when we don't know how much it will be. I guess my other question for Mr. Rob is, given that NOHFC has supported financially several large projects in our community of late, I'm thinking of the Memorial Sports Center renovations, I'm thinking of the Sister Kennedy Center expansion, I'm thinking of the Legion Park rehabilitation. What are the chances that we're going to get the money that we need, and what happens if we don't? At what point do we say it's not enough, the town can't cover what we have to cover?
Thank you, and through the chair, an excellent question. The NOHFC programs are excellent programs, and we have a number of open files. You mentioned a few of them. There are a couple other ones, and we have some others in the application stage right now. So there's lots going on in our world, the town world, with NOHFC. They are great programs. They do have a funding cap of 75%, up to $500,000. So we are working within that umbrella. Of course, we're going to try and cover 75% of our total project costs, and we'll try and scope our project to meet that. There's always, of course, with any grant program, the risk that we will not be successful. And like I said, that's why I kind of have this laid out in the way in the order that I do, so that we can get some funding confidence before we undertake the work of developing the RFP and getting it out there and evaluating it to then find out that we don't have the financial contribution from the grantors that we are hoping to. So, at the end of the day, as Councillor Rosen had alluded to, we don't know what the rehabilitation costs are going to be. We don't know what the scope of the rehabilitation is going to be at this point in time. All things we still have to figure out. But really, the step one is to secure some funding to do something, and hope that we can come up with some creative solutions to the issues that we have there, to work within that budget allocation. If at some point in time we get down a path where the work that we have to do is too costly, then the report is going to come back to council and say, what do we want to do? We need X number of dollars. We only have so much grant funding. We only have so much money in our reserves. How do we want to proceed with this? So I hope we don't get down to that point. I hope I don't have to write that report to council. But at this point in time, like I said, stage one is to set a path forward, and start looking for that grant funding to support the project.
Thank you, Mr. Rob. Yeah, I certainly don't have a problem with number 4, which is approving of the unbudgeted operating expenditure, because you estimated about $11,000, which I think is doable. We don't want to get too far behind so that when we have to do it again, it's that much more expensive down the road. So I don't have a problem with that. I'm certainly in favor of discussing with the Kiwanis Club opportunities or perhaps ways to discuss the initial restrictions we had on the property, and if there's a manner of which we can work around that to see if we can improve revenues down the road. But at the bottom line is I'm still caught on number 3. So does that have to be in tonight, or can that something that could be added once we get the RFP and we know the firmer numbers, or is that something that has to be part of the process tonight, even though it's a blank check, as Councillor McTaggart put it? Thank you.
If I can, through the chair, really my intent on having number 3 in there. I don't want to go through the work of putting an RFP together and putting it out there and then have council come back and say, yeah, we don't really want to spend any unbudgeted capital to do this. So really, I'm looking for, the approval, and maybe we could do a friendly amendment, approval in principle of the unbudgeted capital. As I mentioned, with the RFP, it'll come back to council for approval of the final award and whatever that number happens to be for that work. But before we go down that path, I'd like to get council support on that unbudgeted expenditure.
Thank you, Chair. First, I want to thank you, Travis, for putting this together. It's exactly what I was hoping to see in terms of how we move forward with this. I hope, though, that NOHFC isn't our only option, and that we will look at other options for funding, whether it be provincial, federal, whatever. I know we're often notified of different funding opportunities. So even though the motion says NOHFC, I understand that this is the first step for the RFP process. And moving forward beyond that, just to keep our eyes and ears open for other sources. Thank you.
Councillor Mackey.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Rob's suggestion at the end, as far as the capital expenditure, I think I can live with that. He's not going to go out and spend money without coming back to us to say it's going to be $700 million to do this or something like that. Don't. But I think doing a renovation on a 50-year-old log building is like putting lipstick on a pig. And 10 years down the road, it's still a log building with a facelift. And I'm thinking 50 years down the road, what are we going to have there but 100-year-old buildings with lipstick on them? So my thought is more so having a vision. How do we do something with that entire property so that it's going to be there for 50 years without us having to, this council, the next council, and so on, looking at $500,000 here and $1 million there, giving it another facelift. And second, I guess my point would be, the way we currently use it and historically has been used is 3 months of the year. It's not utilized for 75% of the year. And when it is open, organizations book it and the community doesn't have access to just run down there and go hang out on the beach. So I think the current way it's used inhibits the entire town from ever fully utilizing it. Not to mention that we don't use it for 9 months of the year. And so to create a vision where we are utilizing it is a must for us. I may not be here down the road, but our kids and grandkids will be able to utilize that property for decades to come if we initiate a proper vision and a plan for that. Yes, it's going to cost more money. And I'm not necessarily saying jump on it now. I'd like to see us get that up and running so that it can be used initially, but we need a long-term plan that doesn't entail facelifts on 50-year-old structures. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions for Mr. Robb? Thank you very much for your report, Travis. It will come before regular council meeting tonight for a vote. That moves us to item 6.3, the Hallett Brewing application, manufactured by the glass endorsement. Pardon me. The recommendation reads, that council receive report AR-23-0277 regarding Hallett Brewery's application to the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario for a manufacturer's limited license sale by the glass license, and that the corporation of the town of Fort Frances support Hallett Brewing's application to the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario for a manufacturer's limited license sales by the glass license for the brewery located at 408 Scott Street, Fort Frances, Ontario. I think, Madam Clerk, maybe you'd like to talk to us about this?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So before you've received communication with respect to a local business applying to AGCO for a manufacturer's limited license sale, which is also known as by the glass. These are really common applications specifically for breweries and wineries. So they are required as part of their application process to request a resolution of council endorsing their application with AGCO, which will enable them to move forward in the next step of their application process. So without this resolution, it really restrict them from moving forward with their application process. So this does not waive any requirements in terms of business licensing, zoning requirements, or any other bylaws that the town would have. Those still all apply. So essentially, this is a routine type of resolution that we're looking for in terms of endorsement. Again, promoting town businesses in terms of our strategic plan that we talked about earlier. Also providing some opportunities for more tourism and those types of opportunities within the town of Fort Frances. So the recommendation is to endorse the recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Any questions? Okay, this item also will come before a regular council meeting tonight for a vote. And I'm very pleased to say that we're now number 7, adjournment, 7.1. At the meeting adjourned at 7:13 p.m. The recommendation reads that this meeting on the Committee of the Whole of Council of the Town of Fort Frances be now closed. Have a mover and seconder, please. Councillor Bernetta. Councillor Mackey. All in favor? Carried. Thank you, everybody. My apologies. Okay. I'll
call this meeting of the Council of the Town of Fort Frances to order, this being session number 23. I'll do the territorial acknowledgement that we respect and truly acknowledge that we are on Treaty 3 territory, traditional land of the Anishinaabe people. We also recognize our local Métis Nation that shares the spiritual history of this land. And I want to add one more thing, that this summer will be the 150th anniversary of the signing of Treaty 3. Let's take a moment of meditation. Thank you. Okay, we're at the consent agenda.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, Councillor.
there's just one item 1.4, declaration of conflict.
My bad. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I know that you have one.
I do.
Is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest and the general nature thereof? Councillor McTaggart.
Thank you, Your Worship. Item 5.3 on the council agenda is in regards to the strategic plan awarding of a contract. And my conflict is that my daughter works for KPMG. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McTaggart. And now we'll go to the consent agenda. There's a recommendation that the following consent items be approved. Regular council items 2.2, 2.3, and 2.4. Item 2.2, the recommendation is that council receive the correspondence from the resident of 618 3rd Street East, and that council refer this request to the Planning and Development Executive Committee for recommendation. Item 2.3 is correspondence from the Canadian Bass Championships, and the recommendation is that council receive the correspondence submitted by the Fort Frances Canadian Bass Championship scheduled for July 19th and 22nd, 2023, and that the request be referred to the Administration and Finance Executive Committee for recommendation with input from all other executive committees. And item 2.4, the recommendation is that council receive the correspondence submitted by the Rainy River Veterinarian Services Committee, and that the request be referred to the Administration and Finance Executive Committee for recommendation. I need a mover and seconder for that. Councillor McTaggart, Councillor Mackey. Any discussion on any of those? Seeing none, calling the question, all in favor? And that is carried unanimously. Moving on to item 3.1, approval of council minutes. Recommendation is that the meeting minutes of council meeting session number 21 of May 4th, 2023, and number 22 dated May 8th, 2023, having been typed and distributed, be approved. Mover and seconder, please. Councillor Bernetta, Councillor Bien. Any discussion? All in favor? Carried. No one is opposed. Item 4, approval of Committee of the Whole minutes. Recommendation before us is that the meeting minutes of the Committee of the Whole session number 11, dated May 8th, 2023, having been typed and distributed, be approved. Mover and seconder, please. Councillor Olson and Councillor Mackey. Any discussion? All in favor? Carried. No one is opposed. On to item 5, resolutions from tonight's Committee of the Whole meeting. Recommendation that the presentation of the draft 2022 audited financial statements from BDO Canada LLP be received, and that the corporation of the town of Fort Francis draft consolidation financial statement for the year ending December 31st, 2022, as prepared by BDO Canada LLP, be hereby approved as attached hereto and forming part of this resolution. Mover and seconder, please. Councillor Bernetta, Councillor McTaggart. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? Carried. No one is opposed. Item 5.2, recommendation is that the presentation of the final report of the governance review from KPMG be received and that council directs administration to review its finding and bring back recommendations for implementation. Mover and seconder, please. Councillor Behan, Councillor McTaggart. Any discussion? All in favor? Carried unanimously. From Committee of the Whole, 5.2. The Council of the Town of Fort Francis agrees with the recommendation of administration from item AR-23-0266 1, prepare a bylaw authorizing the mayor and clerk to implement the video surveillance policy on behalf of the corporation, and 2, prepare a bylaw authorizing the mayor and clerk to execute the video surveillance system access agreement with His Majesty the King in the right of Ontario as represented by the Minister of Community Safety and Correctional Services, operating as the Ontario Provincial Police, Rainy River District, Northwest Region on behalf of the corporation. Councillor McTaggart is moving. I need a seconder. Councillor Bernetta. Any discussion on this? Seeing none, all in favor? Carried unanimously. Item 5.3, and Councillor McTaggart has declared a conflict of interest on this. The council approval of report AR-23-0273 will agree with the recommendation of administration to award the development of a corporate strategic plan to KPMG, and further that the mayor and clerk be authorized to execute the agreement on behalf of the corporation. Mover and seconder, please. Councillor Behan, Councillor Olson. Any discussion on this one? Seeing none, all in favor, and that is carried. No one is opposed. Item 5.4, Sunny Cove, recommendation is council approval of report AR-23-0274 will agree with the recommendation of the administration that 1, administration apply to the Northern Ontario Heritage Fund Corporation for funding to address the structural condition of Russell Hall. 2, that administration upon receipt of the funding issue an RFP for the completion of the structural design work, including preparation of tender specifications and drawings. 3, the council approve the unbudgeted capital expenditure related to the completion of the work. 4, the council approve the unbudgeted operating expenditure required to maintain the property for the summer, including grass cutting, trimming, and general yard cleanup. 5, the council direct administration to begin preparing to operate Sunny Cove Camp in the summer of 2024, and further that bookings start to be taken for late summer 2024. 6, and further that administration discuss with the Kiwanis Club the continued relevance of the restrictions originally imposed when the town took over Sunny Cove to investigate removing some to potentially open the property up to new uses and revenues. Mover and seconder, please. Okay, question to Councillor Bernetta.
Just, I believe there was a friendly amendment to number 3, just that council approve in principle the budgeted capital expenditures.
Yes, thank you for that. Okay, so we will amend it. So you're going to move the amendment. The council approve in principle the budgeted capital expenditure related to police purposes. Yeah, I'm just inserting the word approve in principle the unbudgeted. Yeah. So that amendment is moved by Councillor Brunetta. I need a seconder on the amendment, Councillor Mackey. So on the amendment, any discussion? Calling the question on the amendment, all in favor? That's carried. So now on the main motion, which if you'll permit me, I'm not going to read the whole thing again, except for item 3, which has been amended to read that council approve in principle the unbudgeted capital expenditure related to the completion of this work. So on the main motion, then I need a mover and seconder. Councillor Olson. Councillor Brunetta. So on the main motion, any discussion? Councillor Bien.
I'd just like to clarify that remarks that are made during the committee of the whole meeting, that if the RFP comes in high or outside of our realm of ability to cover our share of the cost, it could be stopped then. Is that correct?
Yeah, through the chair. Absolutely. If something comes out through the RFP process that either the cost to the design work or the rehabilitation work is just going to be way too costly, then that's when we would have a report brought forward that says we need to go a different path.
You okay with that? You okay with that, Councillor Bien? Any other discussion? Councillor Olson?
Thank you. One thing I just wanted to put on the table for consideration, I guess, or maybe perhaps an amendment to the motion, was looking at a business plan for this site. And I appreciate CAO Rob and the work that he's done. And I mean, I feels like it's painstaking to try to get this to a place of like feasibility, but also using the site to what we want to use it for. And I feel like as a council member, I'm not really sure what the plan is for the location, whether we're using it for community member usage, or if we really are looking at running this as a business to keep it from becoming a deficit every year. So that was one thing I was hoping to propose tonight as an addition perhaps to that recommendation. I know we don't have an ECDev person, and I feel like that's where they would fill this gap. But having like a concrete plan of what the space would be used for as part of that visioning.
Thank you.
So yeah, so that would change the scope of the resolution as it stands right now. That being said, the motion previous to this did approve the award of your strategic plan to KPMG. Now, maybe a recommendation council wants to consider as part of your strategic plan initiatives is to review the use of this property within your strategic plan, which would incorporate a much bigger picture of, like Councillor Mackey was incorporating. So it's a suggestion in terms of the motion is just to kind of get things moving tonight in terms of, you know, some of the basic maintenance needs and those things that need to happen. But for a larger picture, your strategic plan is where you probably want to have this conversation.
Councillor Olson, are you okay with approaching your suggestion through the strategic plan, which is coming forth in June and will be well advertised? And this is one of the issues that will be discussed.
I appreciate that. As long as it's discussed
Yeah.
during that time, I don't want to be forgotten.
And thank you again for raising that issue. Councillor Bien?
Yes, just further that number 6 there tells administration to discuss with Kiwanis Club the way we can maybe broaden the scope of what we can do at Sunny Cove by reducing the restrictions that are on the initial deal. So I think that's part and parcel. We have to get that cleared up first before we can even, I think, begin to look at what we want to do with a vision, because right now we're sort of, I don't think we can, given the initial restrictive covenants on the property. That's how I'm understanding it anyway. So I think when we discuss with Kiwanis what we can maybe do to get out of these restrictive covenants, then will give us a springboard as to what we can maybe do with the property then going forward at perhaps the strategic plan as has been suggested. Thank you.
Councillor Brunetta.
Yeah, and don't forget that we also have a Sunny Cove Advisory Committee. So they should definitely be involved in some sort of discussion around how this property is used as well.
Thank you, Councillor Brunetta. Just before I go back to Councillor Bien, had you had your hand up earlier, Councillor McTaggart? Okay, back to you, Councillor Bien.
Just to Councillor Burnett's point, I'm not sure the Sunny Cove Advisory Committee still exists. I thought maybe it was dissolved when we were going the first route to try and get a leasee or a buyer for the Sunny Cove project. So I'm not even sure the Sunny Cove Advisory Committee is in effect right now, to be honest. Thank you.
The clerk thinks you're correct. That's good enough for me. Councillor Mackey.
Thanks, Your Worship. To Councillor Bien's point, as far as not being able to proceed until we get some accommodation from Kiwanis, I would suggest that possibly it would be easier for them to acquiesce if we came to them with a plan that incorporated the usage by the entire town throughout the whole year. And I don't see them saying no to a decent plan that is going to be utilized by the community. That's what their function and their goal and
CAO, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. You're good? Yep, CAO Rob.
Thank you through the chair, and to hopefully try and put this to bed here. Absolutely to Madame Clerk's point, the strategic plan, I think, is the perfect place to have this discussion. Kind of my intent on item number 6 is along the same lines. Historically, we've worked collaboratively with Kiwanis on the operations of the camp, and I see that relationship continuing. And I think any business planning that happens for that camp is going to, again, be in partnership with Kiwanis. At this point in time, we can't operate the camp at all. So I think that's probably a prudent first step, is get it to a state where we can operate it in some capacity, and then work on what that capacity looks like into the future.
Thank you. Further questions or comments? Last chance. Calling the question. All in favor? Let me have that again. All in favor, please leave your hands up so I can see. Okay. This is on the main motion now. We voted on the amendment that passed, so the main motion includes the amendment. And we had the discussion. Everybody voted in favor. It passed. I know it got a lengthy discussion. It's hard to keep track sometimes, but we're okay. And I know that if we weren't. So that's carried, and there was nobody opposed. Okay, item 5.5. Recommendation is that council receive report AR-23-0277 regarding the Hallett Brewing's application to the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario for a manufacturer's limited license sales by the glass license, and that the corporation of the town of Fort Frances support Hallett Brewing's application to the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario for a manufacturer's limited license sales by the glass license for the brewery located at 408 Scott Street, Fort Frances, Ontario. Mover and seconder, please. Councillor Bien, Councillor Olson. Any discussion on this one? All in favor? Carried. No one opposed. That brings us to bylaws. Resolution reads that the following bylaws be introduced and read and finally passed, signed by the mayor and clerk, sealed with the corporate seal, and become law forthwith. Bylaw 41-23 being a bylaw of the town of Fort Francis to adopt an employee appreciation / recognition and expression of care policy. Bylaw 42-23 being a bylaw of the town of Fort Francis to adopt a volunteer recognition policy. Bylaw 43-23 being a bylaw to authorize the execution of an agreement between the town of Fort Francis and Enterprise Rent-A-Car Canada Limited. Bylaw 44-23 being a bylaw to authorize the execution of an agreement between the town of Fort Francis and GHD Digital, bids and tenders vendor pay model. And bylaw 45-23 being a bylaw to accept the funding award through the 2023 Canada Summer Jobs Program between His Majesty the King in right of Canada as represented by the Minister of Employment and Social Development, therein after referred to as Canada, and the Corporation of the Town of Fort Francis. And finally, bylaw 46-23 being a bylaw to designate a site plan control area. Mover and seconder, please. Councillor McTaggart. Councillor Mackey. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? Carried. No one is opposed. That brings us to information and correspondence, and there's a whack of it, 15, so I'm not going to read them all. They're in front of you. If there are any items from 7.1 to 7.15 that you'd like pulled or discussed, feel free to do so now. Councillor Mackey.
7.1, please.
Okay, go ahead.
So in reading the letter, I'm wondering why it wasn't renewed with the people that ran the sorting gap over the last year with all the commotion out there about it.
Excellent question, and CEO Rob is going to answer that.
Thank you through the chair. The lease term expired at the end of the day. The lessee had an opportunity to express an interest for one additional year. They had to do so by the end of September of 2022 to provide us with budget security, so we would know how to budget accordingly for the operation or else some other arrangement. They did not, so their contract expired. Contract expiry took place over the weekend, and we are gearing up to open up the sorting gap again under the operation of the town.
Yes.
Thank you. So the organization did not come back to you at any point from last fall till present to renew the 1-year extension?
Go ahead, CEO Rob.
Thank you through the chair. In my capacity now spoke with the proponents 3 times and 3 times tried to come up to some sort of terms to extend their operation, and in the 3 times that we discussed it, I was not able to secure a deal with them.
Thank you, CEO Rob.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other items of correspondence? Yes, Councillor Bernetta.
Actually, just further to item 7.1. So that does mean that the town will still be operating the marina under the umbrella of the town's services. And will there be ice cream? Everyone is asking me.
CEO Rob.
Yes and yes. So yes, we will be operating it as we have in the past.
And providing all the same services. Any further questions on that or any other items of correspondence? All righty then, that brings us to agenda item 8, minutes of local boards and committees. 8.1 is the Business Improvement Area Board of Management meeting minutes of April 12th, 2023. 8.2 is the Sister Kennedy Center Board of Management meeting minutes of January 11th, February 1st, March 8th, and April 12th, 2023. We have nothing in camera. And so that brings us to the last motion that this meeting of the town of of the council of the town of Fort Francis be now closed. I got to go with Councilor McTaggart and McMackey. Seconded. If we can't get at least one McMackey in per meeting, we have failed. Thank you, everyone. Oh, we better vote. Better call the question. All in favor? And that's carried. Thank you, everyone. In particular, with some excellent discussion on some items.